Welcome to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.
Is anyone telling the whole truth about the Rendlesham Forest Incidents of 1980? Come on, voice, let's go. Are certain witnesses deliberately covering up facts? What was happening at Rendlesham before and after the events everyone knows about?
Hello and welcome to the 1006th edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno, coming to you from WOON AM and FM radio in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, on the Paranormal Radio app, from TalkStream Live on YouTube. I'm Ben, and that was Paul, and today we bring back a recent guest to continue our journey through what's arguably the best documented UFO encounter of all time. Retired British police detective and Royal Air Force veteran Gary Heseltine is vice president of the International Coalition for Extraterrestrial Research, ICER or ICER, composed of scientists, academics, and leading UFO/UAP researchers worldwide. Using skills learned as a police officer, Gary has examined cases with the best evidence, often corroborated by technology. In 2002, he founded the database Police Reporting UFO Sightings, or PRUFOs. At the Citizens Hearing on UFO Disclosure in Washington, D.C., Gary has testified on behalf of police officers worldwide who are UFO witnesses. He is founder and editor of the monthly UFO magazine, UFO Truth. Gary's new book, Non-Human, The Rendlesham Forest Incidents, 42 Years of Denial, is the recent of a 5-year-plus re-investigation of Britain's most famous UFO event. Gary participated in our own lengthy series of CBS radio special shows on the Rendlesham case in 2010 and 2011, and today marks his 9th appearance on Behind the Paranormal.
10th, actually. I recounted.
Well.
So we're going to dump the script at this point, and Gary is going to do something that's never been done before and take us through all 17 incidents that happened at Rendlesham. So Gary, take it away.
Yes, sir.
Right, okay, I realise we've got an hour. This has never been done before. It's obviously in the conclusion section of my book and when we talked before, I went through some of the incidents, a lot of the newer stuff, but I listed 17 events that I think now comprise over the late December period. And what I suggested to Paul and Ben ahead of the show was, let's do something different, and they've agreed. And I said I wanted to take you through those 17 in a chronological, as best you can, order. Bear in mind that 42 years, nearly 43 years after the event, this is not an easy thing to do. But I've attempted to do it, and here we go. Alright, and so, what we have, we're going to look at 17 cases. The first one is actually pre-Christmas. Okay? Pre-Christmas. And the pre-Christmas one occurs on the 23rd of December. Then we're going to look at 13 what are as best described chronological, as best we can work out, based on the eyewitness testimony, fitting it in with what we already know and expanded on what we know. And then there are 3, the final 3, that are in a sense, you can't put a certain date on them, but they're within that cluster. They're within the late December period. So you've got 1 pre-Christmas, 13 in a fairly straightforward chronological, and then you've got 3 that could be any of the last 2 or 3 nights of activity. And you'll see what I mean. Okay, so let's sit back and let's try to do something different, and hope I can do it in an hour. Okay, 23rd of December, nobody has ever heard of 23rd of December. And what that basically refers to is an airman called Steve Wagner. And Steve Wagner and a colleague were sent to the East Gate. Most people who know the case will be familiar with the East Gate as a kind of an integral part of many of the starting points or connected with the case. So, Steve Wagner, who had an earlier sighting during 1980, had been told, in a sense, do not bother us about these sightings, so he decided if ever I see anything again, I will not report it because I was given a hard time. He is sent to the East Gate with a colleague, a US Air Force Security Police colleague, to speak to a US security police officer who's on the gate. Now this is interesting in itself because the gate at Eastgate wasn't routinely manned. So why there was a security police officer on the 23rd, and he's pretty adamant it's before Christmas, based on his shifts, is unknown. But let's take it that he's right. So it's the 23rd, it's his event. And he says he's sent there because an airman, US Air Force Security Police, has rang in to Central Security Control and he's been scared by something that's landed or come down in a clump of trees near to the East Gate. Now, those familiar with the East Gate will know that the forest now is at the end of the East Gate Road, which is approximately 300 metres from what would be then the old East Gate in 1980, along to the bottom of the road where it meets with the public country road, and the forest is basically behind. But in 1980 there were many more trees that hadn't been blown down in the late storm of 1987, which destroyed 90% of the forest, and basically those were still there and very close to the East Gate, and he'd been spooked by something that had either landed, crashed or whatever near the East Gate, but approximately only 150 metres. Now nobody had ever talked about anything as close to that at the East Gate. So if you had your back to your East Gate, you're looking at 45-degree angle to your right, 150 metres where there were clumps of trees then, and this security police officer had been spooked. He didn't want to go out there, he was scared, didn't want to be left alone. So anyway, they say we'll go investigate. Now they go investigate the trees. Now they don't see any craft, no UFOs or anything. However, he said in a kind of cryptic remark, but we did find something that was odd. And I said, what? And he said, we found a series of 3 equilateral depressions in the ground in a little clearing in the clump of trees. And he said, and I said, well, how big were these depressions? And he said, each one was 5 feet wide. Now listen to that. 5 feet wide equilateral triangle. Wow, nobody's ever heard of that. We know about John and Jim's, well, certainly Jim Peniston's small 3 metre by 3 metre landed craft, but with depressions 9 or 10 inches in a triangular pattern. And here we have on the 23rd of December, allegedly, and there's no reason why Steve Wagner's going to make this up, but he's a straight up guy, I've talked to him several times. He's saying that the 3 equilateral indentations, triangular depressions, 5 feet across. Wow. That's the pre-Christmas. Nobody had heard of that. It's in the book. Alright, so now we come on to what we would describe as chronological. And we're going to go through 13 of these. So event number 2 is the thing that, in a sense, historically has kicked off all of the Rendlesham story because it's included in the Holt Memorandum, written by then Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt. So this is what we would have called a long time the first night incident. We're talking the night of the 25th into the 26th. And this involves Sergeant Bud Steffens and Airman John Burroughs. They're on mobile patrol. They're on the country road leading to the back gate at Arif Woodbridge. They're still on the country road, and where you turn right to go to the East Gate Road and up to the East Gate, just as they're approaching, they see to their left, from their perspective, some lights above the trees that they didn't recognise. Now, this is a bit of a misnomer. A lot of people think that the first sighting takes place from the actual East Gate. It didn't. It takes place at the corner of East Gate Road and the forest. So what you've got is they pull over, literally at the end of the East Gate Road, where you would turn right to go on that road to the East Gate. They pull over, they go into the forest a short distance, see lights that are murky shining through the trees. And bear in mind, these are Corsican pines. They're long, thin, they're like, there's no low branches, so they can see that there's lights moving. Now, here's the thing, they get out the vehicle, they go in a few metres. I think they kind of get spooked, and certainly Sergeant Steffens, Bud Steffens, gets spooked by these strange lights because they can't identify them. And so they go back to the vehicle, and then they turn right, and think we'll report this, and we'll report it from the Eastgate. So they drive up the Eastgate Road, 300 metres, to the back gate of RAF Woodbridge. They've got the keys to the gate, they open up and they're in. They then use a telephone line in the sentry box for inclement weather to contact Central Security Control. So, in a sense, the first event is when Sergeant Stephens is the first person. John Burroughs confirmed that it's in the book, in a transcript. He says it was actually Bud Stephens, Sergeant Stephens, that saw the lights first. So he's the first one to see this, in what we refer to as the first night lights. So then, having seen the lights, now, here's an interesting thing. Having got out the vehicle, they returned to the vehicle where they were going to drive to the Eastgate. However, what really frightened, it would seem, Sergeant Stephens, is that when they got back in the vehicle, a white light sphere, whatever you want to call it, was now not over the trees, it was now sat on the roadside, low to the ground, approximately 20-30 metres away, up the road. And that kind of frightened him, as it would do. And so he then, was keen to get back to the sanctuary of the Eastgate and the base. So they go to the base. They then use the phone. So that's the incident, the second incident. Okay? Then we go to the third incident. Now bear in mind, incidents are broken down by time differences. So, you get in the vehicle, there's then a time difference. Then they drive up to the gate, they go in, they make telephone call. They then request backup. And this is where Sergeant Peniston and Ed Kabanzak, his driver, turn up a few minutes later. So this is a time difference. And what I'm saying is the third incident is literally by the Eastgate, Jim Peniston and Ed Kabanzak, his driver, turn up in a vehicle. They speak to Bud Stephens, they speak to John Burroughs, and John Burroughs and Bud Stephens say, look at those lights, pointing down the Eastgate Road to approximately 300 metres away, where strange lights, undetermined lights, could be seen above the forest canopy and slightly through the trees. So they then become a third part of this first incident, because they then turning up, it's minutes later, there's a break in time, hence why it's a different timed event. So you have new witnesses in the form of Ed Kabanzak, and you have Jim Peniston, who are there with Burroughs and Bud Stephens, and they corroborate the fact that there's something strange above the lights. Jim Peniston is thinking, despite being told by Bud Stephens that it landed, it didn't crash, despite that, Jim Peniston thinks we're dealing with a possible downed aircraft. A logical assumption, I guess. But he ignores what Bud Stephens said. He's thinking it's a downed aircraft, accident or whatever. So that's the third incident. So they ring up the phone, and then they go, can we go and investigate? Now, Bud Stephens, the sergeant, is so scared by what he's already seen, he said, I don't want to go back out there. This is the sergeant. So, Jim Peniston, John Burroughs and Ed Kabanzak go out on mobile from there, get permission. So they go off on mobile down the Eastgate Road, 300 metres. They then turn right. There's some speculation about whether they turn right or left. I believe they turn right a short distance. Actual distance, we're not sure. The layout of the forest is different. But then they take a left turn into the forest and go up what would have then been a single track. Okay? And they go as far as they can go to where they can't go any further because of the trees blocking the path. And this what is now referred to as the staging area. It's the area where the vehicles have to park because they couldn't go any deeper. They go there, and they have to park up and then go out on foot. As they go out on foot, eventually this is where Jim will say he came across a small 3 metre by 3 metre black glass-like object at or near the ground, within a few feet of the ground. And he would say it was like black glass, it was warm to the touch, and at various points it had raised etchings on it like an etching on glass of, say, a car windscreen. And it also had some symbols. And so he walked around it, he took a roll of photographs that later he was told didn't come out. So this is what we regard as the first night landing. Now, interestingly, John Burroughs, who was with Jim Penniston throughout, would say that he was slightly back from Jim Penniston, so he wasn't as close to the object, which was illuminated from within, so not easy to see from his vantage point. He's several meters back, and he would say he saw a bank of lights. He didn't see the structured object that Jim Penniston did, because Jim actually touched it, walked around it, etc. for many minutes. So John's description of the craft right from the off is not of a definitive triangular craft like Jim Penniston had said. He would say that it's a bank of lights that suggested a structure behind the light. Okay, so that would then be the fourth sighting. Now, what you have then is, after that object is then seen, as certainly described by Jim Penniston, to raise up off the ground, tilt at an angle and shoot away in the blink of an eye, once that happens, they then go forward, because they see other lights, they go forward, but then they realise it's probably just a lighthouse in the distance, and they decide to go back. Interestingly, the fifth sighting would be as they're walking away from the forest, back, or through the forest, back towards the staging area where they've left the vehicle. And as they're walking back, they see an object streak, a small object, streak above their heads, another unidentified object. So that becomes the fifth sighting. Now, Ed Kabanzak, by the way, the driver, will kind of argue, he hasn't gone on the record for the book, but what he's said in interviews where he has been interviewed on camera and comments that he's made, he would say that he actually saw the craft on the ground, got closer to it than what certainly Jim Penniston would say. Jim Penniston would say that he kept Ed Kabanzak further back to act as a radio relay because the signal was breaking up in the forest, which is probably true because the radios weren't great at the time, and plus maybe the atmospherics that were being affected by what was in there. From Ed Kabanzak's point of view, he would say that he saw craft, and he may have been with them, I don't rule it out, that he may have been with Jim and John as they walked back to the staging area. It's not clear, but at least two of them, Jim and John, see the other object streaking above. Now, this is away from the lighthouse, interestingly, so it never could have been the lighthouse, could it? Because it's going the wrong direction. But anyway, the skeptics out there have fed on this for a long time. Time to put it all to bed. So, in a sense, what you then have in that, what we would class as night one of 4 consecutive nights, that I now believe are 4 consecutive nights, not 3, there are actually 4 incidents there. So we've gone through 23rd of December, Eastgate, Stephens and Burroughs. Then we've got Penniston, Burroughs, Stephens and Kabanzak, all at the Eastgate seeing it. That's 3. 4, Jim Penniston into the forest. They see a craft on the ground. John Burroughs sees lights suggesting a structure. Then the last one is Jim Penniston, John Burroughs. This is the 5th event, and possibly Ed Kabanzak on the way back to the staging area see a light streak above them, unidentified light. So that's night 1. So we're already now coming to number 6, and we're not doing bad time. Okay, so a long time we didn't know really anything about what we would consider now the second night. For a long time, according to the Holt Memorandum, there were just 2 nights, set literally 48 hours apart. Okay, the John and Jim, which was popularly thought of as the landed craft, and then Holt's night. Alright, we now know over time, through Laurie Bowen, who was a US security police officer at the Eastgate, on what we believe is the night of the 26th into the 27th of December. She's deployed at the Eastgate. She sees a flaming object descend into the forest in front of her. She uses a phone box, inclement weather, sentry telephone, rings it in central control and says something has gone down in the forest. And it turns out that the first person who is able to respond is one of the shift commanders, Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin, a young female, black female officer, very popular, well respected, promising career, and she happens to have just left RAF Bentwaters, which is approximately 4 miles distant away from the twin base complex, and basically the forest is in the middle between Bentwaters, the forest, and then Woodbridge. So she's travelling, as it happens, on a rural country road. The next thing, in a sense, that we knew for a long time is that Laurie Bowen and John Drummond Torsey, another US security police officer, have gone on the record to say that they suddenly hear, a few minutes later, Bonnie Tamplin screaming over the radio, something akin to, "Bobby, Bobby, help, help, help," and she's terrified over the radio. We didn't know what it was for a long, long time. However, now we do, thanks to Michael Stacey Smith. We talked about it in the first show. So, let's find out in a brief. She's on that country public road, en route to investigate light seen going into the forest near Eastgate, as reported by Laurie Bowen. As she's driving along, this is what we now believe that has happened via Airman Michael Stacey Smith. A beach ball size object, glowing object, red glowing object, comes at hedgerow height and flies alongside her vehicle. Can you imagine that? On a rural, lonely country road. She's terrified. She loses control of the vehicle, and she ends up losing control and rolling it into a ditch. The vehicle turns on its side. She clambers out, and the object, the beach ball size object, has stopped and is looking down at her. She is so terrified that she picks up her weapon and starts firing. Bang, bang, bang. Then the object leaves. We know about this as a first-hand witness, in part, through Michael Stacey Smith, who was dispatched from the security police building of Bentwaters and told quickly to get to the Butley Gate to open up the back gate. And then he sees a convoy of police vehicles go rushing out into the forest. He doesn't know why. A few minutes later, he sees Sergeant Robert Ball, who is part of that convoy, bringing back through the Butley Gate at Bentwaters. He sees Bonnie Tamplin, front passenger seat. She's dishevelled, she's crying, she's shaking, she's clearly distraught. He witnesses that firsthand. Off she goes onto the base. He doesn't know what's happened to her. Then, literally a few minutes later, another vehicle turns up. It turns out to be Bonnie Tamplin's vehicle. Whilst it's being rolled, it's still able to be driven, and somebody has driven it back. But he sees first-hand testimony of damage sustained to the vehicle, corroborating the story that he's later told by the sergeant, i.e. of the object travelling alongside country road, effectively running her off the road, shots fired. Everything was covered up on that incident. So this is the 6th incident, and it's an incredible one. Or it's the 7th incident, because Laurie Bowen was the one to see the object going into the forest. So minutes later, we now have the 7th incident broken down, which is Bonnie Tamplin, and the fact that shots were fired. She left a weapon at the scene in a rural country location. She was terrified. She was shipped back to the States within 6 days, never to be seen of again in terms of going back on shift, etc. So that's the 7th incident, and it was all covered up. The bullets, the vehicle was picked up, the weapon was picked up. There's some speculation about whether it was an M16 or a sidearm, but it was confirmed that shots were fired from a firearm. All the rounds were put back into the armoury, so there was nothing amiss. That incident has been covered up for 42 years. On a British rural public road. It should be a front page story. How many other stories have you heard like that? So, then we go into now, incident number 8. Now this is the next night. This is going to be what would be the precursor to what we would call the Holt Night, which has long been regarded as the Holt Night, the 3rd night of activity. So we're talking the 27th into the 28th. And here we've got, now there's some discrepancy here, and the date could be wrong, but at the last junction, last comment by Munro Neville, Sergeant Munro Neville, who was part of Holt's group, he said that it's Saturday the 27th when Lieutenant Bruce England comes to his door, his home, knocks on his door and says, Colonel Conrad would like you to accompany me and go out into the forest because of some strange activity. Off he goes. Where I kind of pick up on this, and it's in the book, there's a clear contradiction, because on several occasions, including your radio show, on 2 occasions, Munro Nevels had been interviewed by yourselves and had said it was Sunday, the 28th, when Lieutenant England knocked at his home and said, will you come out into the forest? Now, what a lot of people don't realise is that whether it was the Saturday or the Sunday, let's go with the Saturday because that's what he's now saying, would make it the 27th into the 28th. They go out into the forest, and whilst they're there, they have an encounter. So we're talking Munro Nevels has a UFO sighting with Lieutenant Bruce England, who has never gone on the record. I wish he would come forward. If he's still alive, we don't know. All right? And what Munro Nevels said in an interview that I had with him several years ago, 2-hour interview, he said that a large pulsing object, perhaps the size of a car, glowing, was looking down at them in the forest, and when Munro Nevels went to go closer towards this object to investigate, it then got bigger and started like pulsing and like inflamed. It was agitated, it was moving. When he walked away, it calmed down. He went back again, starts getting all excited. He goes away. Apparently, Bruce England, who apparently had been in the Marines, not a man to scare easily, he was more than happy when Munro Nevels said, we'll leave it there and we'll go back and tell Colonel Conrad. So this is another sighting that nobody refers to, but it's there if you look in the records. Then, before Holt gets involved, we're still talking about the Holt night, but this is effectively before Holt even gets involved. And it's incidents that when you look for the evidence, it's there if you want to pick up the pieces. The next incident is going to be number 9, and this involves an airman called Greg Battram. Greg Battram, who I believe sadly has passed away, although it's unconfirmed, but somebody sent me an email post the release of my book suggesting that he died and I've been sent an obituary. I have yet to confirm that, but I do believe that he has passed away, which will come as a shock to some people, no doubt, listening to the show, but it needs to be said now. Greg Battram is an airman, and he's with 3 other colleagues. And if you ever watch the CNN documentary, the fine CNN documentary with Chuck DeCaro, you'll see in silhouette him being interviewed several times. So he actually goes on camera. It's all listed in the book, the transcript of what he said in the CNN documentary. And he will say, and there's some graphics used, drawings, rough sketch drawings of what Greg Battram had described. And he said he saw and this is interesting, a circular patch of green, yellow mist on the ground. Now this comes relevant later on, as we'll see. And then there is, in a sense, he did a long interview with a Connecticut police officer called Larry Fawcett in 1984, a really early interview. And he actually said that he may have seen or suggested that from the mist he saw something else, possibly another craft, possibly some kind of life form. It's never been clarified, and he never really got interviewed again after the CNN special that didn't come out until 1985. But his testimony is there, that you can watch the video, you can see what he said. And basically what he's saying is, he and 3 colleagues saw the mist on the ground, then it suggested they saw something else that merged into a craft, or akin to that frightened them so much that they decided to run away. Now we're talking airmen with weapons, possibly, we're not certain. He said he had his weapon with him to Larry Fawcett, because he said he put a round in the chamber as if ready to fire. That suggests to me that he had his weapon with him. And don't forget, this was before the policy of everybody having the vehicle weapons taken off them, which emerged really late during the consecutive incidents. So it's highly likely he did, with his 3 colleagues have their weapons with them, probably M16s. And anyway, they were so frightened that they ran away. And the interesting thing is, when they run away, they run back to the staging area where they'd had to leave the vehicle because nobody could go any further. And he would say, and he said it in the interviews on CNN and basically to Larry Fawcett, the Connecticut detective, that as he got to the staging area, he saw Holt arriving, and he also saw a friend of his, Larry Warren, who I believe is the original military whistleblower, arriving into the forest. Interesting. Okay, so that's incident number 9. So that's 4 people. And in a sense, 3 of them are totally unknown. We don't know their names. And if they're still out there, if they are listening to this show, please contact me. Email heseltinegary@hotmail.com. Contact me. Time is passing and I want to get these accounts on record to make it as clear as possible. So, let's go to night 10. Now this is interesting, and we're not quite sure exactly of the time. This now goes to Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, and this is an entirely new sighting that did not emerge until I interviewed him in a 4.5-hour transatlantic phone call. And I tried using a method of interview that was complicated called the enhanced cognitive model. It's not designed to be used 40 odd years later, but it worked. And he really concentrated and recalled new information. And he recalled this incident. This is before Holt and the others arrived. He said he was on mobile patrol. He was called the NCOIC, which meant that he was on a mobile roving patrol. He was the gopher. So if the colonel or Lieutenant Colonel Holt said, "Go and get me more light holes," he shot away and did what was asked of him. He was the one who kept coming, going back, coming and going back. And it's in this series of times that he'd left and gone back to the forest, left and then come back to the forest, that this particular incident happens. And it happens with Holt still at the staging area. He is told, he thinks it's probably Lieutenant England, to form a line of 20 US Air Force security police officers. You know, like when you see on the ground when they do a fingerprint kind of search of the ground, they're either on the knees crawling forward in a line of 20 going forward, or walking and inspecting the ground, the field, forward together. Well, this is what they do. Now, nobody had ever said anything about this. So when he's telling me this, I'm thinking, what? I've never heard of this. And what he said was, as they went through the forest, and they're moving forward through the trees, and bear in mind, they only had torches, he slipped. And as he slipped underneath a canopy of green mist. He couldn't see it until he was underneath it. And then he said it was like looking up at, if you're underwater and you see the film of the water above you. And he came out and put his head out. It was about 3 feet deep. So this is again this green mist that seems to play a part, and will as we continue on. All right. So he said that as they go in the forest, initially they see one object moving between the trees, skidding around real fast. And then he said there was an explosion, and there was 7 or 8 different objects racing around, multicolours, all through the trees, just above the trees. A spectacular sighting, as good as any, that nobody knew about until he was questioned thoroughly. So that's another incident. And he would say that he was one of 20. Who else saw it? God knows. But that's incident number 10. And of course then we'll move to what was considered to be for a long time the definitive sighting of the event, along with John and Jim's first night landing. This is what's regarded as the Holt night, when Holt leads a small team out. Now here's the interesting thing. Holt leads a team out that includes Sergeant Adrian Bustinza. Remember that. He is one of the 5 who are out for 4.5 hours according to Holt's audio tape. And then they come back, having seen, initially they go to the first night landing site. From there they see a light that's dripping like what looks like molten metal. It's a fiery red, spherical object, glowing, looks like it's got molten metal dripping off it. They follow it through the trees. They then see it for the first time clearly across the open farmer's field, which is approximately 200 metres away. Across the other side, and there's a farmhouse, and it's to the left of the farmhouse. This is important because geographically, I was stood with him for the UFO Hunters program in December 2007, when I stood with him by his marker tree, and there's no big oak tree there, that's his marker, and it's virtually opposite the farmhouse, and he said the object was low to the ground, casting a red glow into the left side of the farmhouse. It looked like it was on fire. It was that intense. They looked at it through a starscope, an early night vision, and they could see a pulsating object through the night vision, like a starscope as they called it. Now the interesting thing is, all those people, the skeptics, will say it was the lighthouse, which was always ridiculous. The lighthouse was clearly visible to him, pulsing every 5 seconds, way off to the distance on the right of the farmhouse. So that's the key point in that. Definitely wasn't the lighthouse. They then follow the object. They cross the farmer's field. They cross a creek, which then in 1980 was quite high in water. They cross up into another field, and he pointed out to me this incident, and because it's continuous, there's lights continuous basically, I've included it as one part. It's one part in these different breakdowns that are allowed to be continuous, because effectively strange lights are seen all the time once they begin, but just in different locations. So they cross the farmer's field, they see objects to the north, no objects to the south. Then the object from the south comes at them at high speed. They're in another farmer's field, not the second farmer's field as regularly being identified. Holt pointed it out to me personally, and it's the one to the right of what was called the second farmer's field, up the creek into a slightly raised field, and an object comes and stops at their feet, or stops above them at about 1,000, 2,000 feet, shines a beam down, 15, 20 seconds, then it goes off. And then effectively it goes back into the sky. Still lights moving around, angle turns, high speed, really one continuous kind of series of UFO events. Can't be the lighthouse. After 4.5 hours of trudging around, according to Holt and the audio tape, he decides to take them back in, the cold and wet. Given what they were witnessing, I find it incredible that they got cold and wet and just said, oh well, we'll just leave it while it's still going on. Beams were still being shone down to the ground. He describes it on the audio. Why he went back in is a mystery to me, because it's so unlike, they could have been under attack, who knows what it was. Why would you go in? You just don't call time just because you're cold and wet. You're in the military, you stay out for as long as it takes. But anyway, that's by the by. They decide to come back in. So they all go back to the staging area. Now, waiting patiently, and has happened during and parallel to the time when Holt was out there, John Burroughs had managed to get a lift in from Ipswich, which was about 11 miles away. He was off duty. He managed to get a lift in. He'd heard on the grapevine that something was happening in the forest. He wanted to get out there. Early on in the audio tape, you hear someone asking for permission for John Burroughs to come forward and join Holt's team, and he says no, later. Anyway, so John Burroughs is at the staging area. Now this is a mystery to me, because I think the staging area would have had many, many people still milling around. Because don't forget it, this is not orderly. This is chaos. Nobody really knows what's happening. A lot of airmen have been told, security police officers have been told to stay there. This is not a just leisurely, it's not organised, it's a bit of chaos. John Burroughs is there. But he will say in a documentary, and it's pointed out in the book, that he saw l'object streak towards one of the light holes that were in the staging area, because they'd had problems with the light holes that wouldn't light up, even though they'd been checked at the motor pool. When they got out into the forest, it mysteriously wouldn't work. Then, basically, he says he sees a small object pass through the windscreen of an open police vehicle, and as it did so, that one of the light holes suddenly illuminated for about 10 seconds as the object was passing through the police vehicle windows. Like, just pulsed up and then died. Object goes. That's another incident. So in a sense, we're now looking at incident number 12. Then, of course, Holt comes back with his team. John Burroughs is still there. He still wants to go out in the forest. And as Holt comes back, he goes over to Holt and says, can I go back out there now you've come back? Holt was reluctant, but he said, yeah, okay. John Burroughs says, Sergeant Bustinza, would you come with me? And I'm sure Adrian Bustinza must have thought, why me? Having just come back in. But anyway, he agrees to go back out. Approximately a few minutes, literally a few minutes later, after going out into the forest, and it doesn't appear to be the farmer's field, it appears to be a pathway near to the field. We're not quite sure where. Adrian Bustinza will say he feels as if he's being pushed from behind, like kicking his legs out, and he falls forward onto his knees. As he falls forward, putting his hands out, suddenly John, who is in front of him several meters, is engulfed in incredible bright light, to the point where he can hardly see John. But part of the beam of the light touches Adrian Bustinza's hand and his groin area, like the shaft of light. Later on, he has medical problems that he still has as a result of what he thinks is that light, some kind of radiation, I suspect, had affected him. He's still got medical issues regarding where the light touched him. John, who we know went on to have life-threatening injuries and got paid out by the VA to get his pension for injuries that were believed to be related to Rendlesham, he's leaning forward on the ground and he's looking forward and he sees John engulfed in an intense bright light. It's so bright he can hardly make out John, but John is 6'6", he's a huge guy. But then, interestingly, he says to me during the 4.5-hour transatlantic call, to the left of John, there is some kind of figure, smaller. To the right of John, there is another smaller figure, John in the middle. Then, they come back to the staging area. And this is interesting. Colonel Holt is waiting for them. Now, according to Adrian Bustinza, he will say that he and John were gone for no more than 10 minutes. However, when they get back to the staging area after this incident, Colonel Holt, or Lieutenant Colonel Holt at the time, is furious with them. Where have you been? You've been gone 40 minutes. So we have a time discrepancy. According to Adrian Bustinza, it's 10 minutes. According to Colonel Holt, it's nigh on 40 minutes. A time discrepancy that we could associate possibly with missing time and a possible abduction scenario. But we clearly have a possible entities seen either side of John Burroughs engulfed in the light. Okay, so that's incident number 13. Wow, we've got 4 left. Alright, now what emerged through the 4.5-hour interview is that Adrian Bustinza had said things over the years. He tried to avoid proper interviews, and he basically said that Larry Warren, the original military whistleblower, had been involved on one of the nights. Now, as far as we were aware at that time, and as to at the time I interviewed him, I was only thinking that that was one night, and for some reason it's all distorted, and it's never been that clear. But he had said on many occasions over the years that Larry Warren was there. The huge kind of argument developed over the years, in recent years, where people had tried to say Larry Warren wasn't there. Colonel Holt attacked him, John Burroughs attacked him, Jim Pennison attacked him. Quite why, I don't know. But anyway, that was the situation. Got very, very ugly. So anyway, when I do this interview, I'm keen to clarify that. And so, late on in the interview, he then tells me that his involvement with a second landing was another night entirely, and not the Holt night. Whoa! Wasn't expecting that. Didn't know what he was going to say. He says, it was on another night. I said, what do you mean it was another night? He says, it was another night I was involved in UFO event. And I wasn't aware that it had more than one night. I said, what you're telling me is that this is an entirely different night to what the incident with Colonel Holt and the team and being out in the forest. Yes. Which kind of makes sense. So we're now talking what I suspect is the night of the 28th into the 29th. That's not nailed on. But he thinks it's possible, and given how it then ties in with Larry Warren. Because don't forget, Larry Warren had said for a long, long time, the original military whistleblower, that he'd been involved in an incident, and he thought it was more towards the end of the month, i.e. the 28th, 29th, but everybody associated it with the night 27, 28. So, Adrian Bustinza was saying, no, this is another night. And it's possibly a consecutive night. So this could be the 28th into the 29th, which then takes it back to what Larry Warren had said. Larry Warren had said that he was picked up from a perimeter gate, taken out to the forest. He got out to the forest, he was taken to a farmer's field. He thought there was an exercise going on, then suddenly he's told to go into a forest. He sees a yellow mist, low hugging circular patch of mist on the ground. He's there. There are all security police officers around this mist. Suddenly a red light comes in from the ocean, stops, beach ball size, stops over the mist. There's an explosion of light, and suddenly where the light had been, the mist had been, there is this shimmering translucent craft, approximately 30 feet across. Now here's the thing. Adrian Bustinza then will say to me in that interview, it's all in the book, transcribed, he will say that this is another night, the next night, and that he says Colonel Holt is there. Larry Warren is there. Larry Warren is within 20 feet of the craft. And he said, I don't know why they picked him, but they told him to go closer towards it. So he corroborated, finally, in a really important interview, that Larry Warren had been there, unequivocal, had been there, and what Warren had said, i.e. was the mist on the ground, had been security police all surrounding this then shimmering craft. He then will say, Adrian Bustinza will say that Colonel Williams, the base commander of 12,000 personnel, was there. And there was some kind of meeting. Warren would say that there was a silent face-off with three entities beside the craft with Colonel Williams from a distance of maybe 10 feet apart. They couldn't hear any words, but there appears to be a face-off. Adrian Bustinza was religious, didn't find it easy to talk about the concept of potential of the life, didn't like the word entities. He kind of preferred to use the word silhouette when he talked about possible life forms. But he basically said there was something there. But he said unequivocally that it was being filmed on motion picture cameras, i.e. video, moving images, not still pictures. He said Colonel Holt was there. He said Larry Warren was there. He said Colonel Williams, the base commander, was there. Long denied by Holt, long denied by Colonel Williams. I absolutely believe Adrian Bustinza is a stand-up guy, 30-year veteran, when then law enforcement career, and then he went into corrections, dealing with prisoners. He was he's a cracking guy. Absolutely couldn't be a better witness. That then happens, and basically you've got this situation where they're surrounded, it's being filmed. Now Larry Warren would say that he was tapped on the shoulder, go away. The incident's still going on. But this is Adrian Bustinza saying that this has occurred. So, absolutely new. So then we come to now incidents 15, 16 and 17. We're nearly there. It's a bit like the top 10 hit parade, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so, don't stop. I'm on a roll. Right, so, we now come to what I call undetermined. It could be night 3, it could be night 4, it could be one of the nights. But I think these suggest either night 3 or night 4. And the first one to look at is Rick Bobo. Rick Bobo was up in the weapons storage area, RAF Pentwaters, on one of the nights. We're not sure which one, but he will say, and has gone on the record to say, that from his high 80-foot vantage point over the forest and looking out towards Woodbridge, he saw a gigantic craft stationary over RAF Woodbridge and part of near the forest. He then would say that smaller objects then came from the large object, akin to a mothership scenario, that went down into the forest. And that's what he will say. He then, in an interview with me, will say that he saw a UFO at the end of the weapons storage area. Okay? And he did a Photoshop drawing with help. We worked on it, and it was at the end of the hot rod. So this is, again, an incident that we weren't really aware of. This at the end of the hot rod. Nobody else has seen a huge, gigantic object, as far as I'm aware, who's gone on the record. So, right, now let's see why this ties in. Now, the last two relate to Airman Steve Longero. Steve Longero just arrived at the base. literally a couple of days after Larry Warren. Now, here's the interesting thing. He knew Larry Warren not very well, but he was on the same training course. When I joined the Air Force, I was with 47 others. At one time, I would have known all their names, but I wouldn't have been friendly with them all. I'd have just known their names through doing drill and whatever classes, and he was the same. He recognized him. Interesting thing, he will say that he was put inside the nuclear weapons storage area. He confirmed it's nuclear weapons. He said he's inside, on the ground, walking around inside the highly protected, inside of the weapons storage area with an experienced airman, possibly a sergeant, you can't remember the name. But he's walking around. He's effectively new on shift, so he's learning the ropes. And then he says that they saw UFO over the forest approximately 200 metres away, and it then shone a beam down into the nuclear weapons hot row, and then proceeded to do this, a grid light search of the entire length of the hot row, which is approximately 200 metres long. Wow, we now have first-hand testimony. We had rumours, now we have first-hand testimony that this guy was there, and we'll go on the record. He had a 30-year law enforcement military career. Stand-up guy, absolutely stand-up guy. And he will say that he saw that. He would give evidence in court on that, no doubt. Stand-up guy. He says he saw the beams, and then he said the beam went off and the object shot off towards Rendlesham Forest. Now, because there was all panic going on, and by the way, I've missed something, all the alarms came on. Holt says, no, we'd have known about that if the alarms come on. According to Steve Longeri, and why would he lie? He said all the alarms and whistles went on. All the lights went up in the weapons storage area. So question, who is lying? I know who my money's on. All right, so the object goes over to the forest, and he hears Jim Peniston's voice on the radio. Yeah, I'm watching it and going in the forest. Now, that's interesting, because Jim Peniston had been given 6 days off after his first night encounter. So why would, if Steve Longeri is right, why would Jim Peniston be there? Well, we've got 5 minutes left. So, off we go. The UFO goes off over the forest. Now, because he's supernumerary, he's new on shift and he was only shadowing somebody, there's all panic going on in the forest. We want extra security police in the forest. So he's told, right, join, get in the back of the truck, leave the weapons storage area, which would normally never happen. Then they would race over to the forest. Get people out there. Get people out there. This is not orderly. This is chaos. We want extra. And by the way, we know that on at least one of the shifts, and it's confirmed in the book by 3 people, that the shift, the afternoon shift that's supposed to finish at 11, stayed on till about 6 in the morning. So you had double the amount of security police, approximately 80 security police, and perhaps anywhere between 10 and 15 law enforcement, perhaps 90 to 100 security police officers out in the forest, merging into what would be a double shift, because there was all panic going on. So that's 16. Now let's go to the last one. He is then told, get in the back of the truck. He gets in the truck, wondering what's going on. He's taken to the forest with 10 or 15 others to the staging area. From there, he says this, Sergeant Peniston takes his group. He shouldn't have been there. Sergeant Peniston takes his group out into the forest near to the landing, or initial first night landing site. And guess what? Just before they get to the first night landing site, they see an object above the trees, unidentified, looking down at them. And he describes it as reddish green, pulsing, brilliant light, and it was watching us, looking down at us. For about 10 minutes they observed it, and then it shot off. 17 incidents, chronological, in 57 minutes. How's that?
That's amazing, Gary. I have to tell you, I think that you're the first person in the history of this show to fit something like that into the entire hour. Thank you.
Actually, it was about 54 minutes if we're going to be technical.
Oh,
so.
yeah, okay. No, that's good. That finish.
So we hear.
I'm a bit thirsty now.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. For
well,
anyone,
you definitely deserve a glass of water or coffee or tea.
For anyone who's
what I've described to you, does it make sense?
It does.
And
for anyone who's watching the video,
does it capture the sense of scale that we're talking about this incident, which has been covered up? And I blame the Americans, I blame the British, I blame the media on both sides of the pond. They have done their damnedest to keep this down, and I personally think that the narrative of the case has been controlled by 3 people in particular: Jim Peniston, Charles Holt, and Nick Pope. for the last 25 years. And they've done a very good job, but it's now time to challenge it.
So the book is Non-Human, the Rendlesham Forest UFO Incidents, 42 Years of Denial. There it is. I got it too. Okay. We're going to have to move on here. Gary, congratulations again. Hang in there for a minute. Okay, I think, what do we have next week, Ben?
So, next week we have a very interesting show we have lined up for you. That's July 30th. The great Mark D'Antonio, astronomer and UFO researcher, will be back with us to talk about the populated universe. And it's been a while since we've had him back on the show, and he's a very close friend of ours, and it's been too long, if you ask me.
Well, not really. It was a few weeks ago.
Oh, it's true, yeah, he was on the
show.
Well, it's been too long for me.
Okay. So we leave you today with two questions from our old friend Stanton Friedman. Do we know what practices would be effective in resisting aliens? And wouldn't the public have to be convinced in all countries that there is such a threat? I'm Paul Eno.
And I'm Ben Eno. And thanks for joining us on our cosmic journey. And we'll catch you next time on Behind the Paranormal.
Return to this radio frequency 167 hours from now for another edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.